how much absorption is there? You've got to have a biscuit that can soak up the gravy. And if you don't, then you're setting people up for failure.
How can a set of skills lead you down the path to success? That's what we're setting out to answer on the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm your host, Michael Sangster. Join me as we unpack how leaders around the world have taken training and skills and turned that into a lasting career. Now let's learn together. Welcome back to the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm Michael Sangster, your host, and I am joined today by one of the more eclectic people I know in my life, one of the most intriguing and interesting, Chad Rogers, partner at Crestview Strategy, old friend. We've been around each other for quite a while in the lobbying world. We did some work together at TELUS, and now, to be clear, we're doing a little bit of work for the National Association of Career Colleges. But Chad is one of those people that's always just fun to be around, because you never quite know what's going to happen. Isn't that a fair way of explaining you, Chad?
I think you've tried to make me sound far more interesting than I am.
Oh, I think we all know you're interesting and intriguing and fun and a little bit irreverent. So let's dive right in. We had an event in Montreal you recently spoke at, and you told the audience of Canadians and Americans that Canada is not a real country.
Well, I love Canada. It's given me a great life, but I'm not one of those people who buys into the myth that the world is asking for more Canada. We are a very middle-of-the-road, mediocre, regulated oligopoly, and there are not people stampeding to our door, as much as we'd like to think there are, saying, please show us how you do it, we'd like to copy it. And we get a little too full of ourselves with our shallow anti-Americanism, where we think that Canada is a little stronger than it is, and I think you see that in the public policy world pretty clearly.
Oh, I think it's fair to say we see that every day. It's too bad you weren't in Kansas City for our World Needs More Canada party.
Yeah, it's not true. The only reason you go to Kansas City is the Truman Library, Oklahoma Joe's and Arthur Bryant Barbecue, and the National World War I Museum.
We did enjoy good barbecue, and we did have Canadian beer with us, so hence we had to have a World Needs More Canada party, and we did have a good time. Everybody came out and joined us. Let's dive into some fun topics here. You have as much experience as anyone in analyzing populist politics. You've done work all over the world on political campaigns. Your partner and friend, Mark Spiro, has done some intriguing work all over the world. You're also a very keen analyzer of the current state of media and where Canada's headed. So let's talk a little bit about what scares you about our politics and our media in Canada.
Nothing. Look, people get a new form of media. And when there's a new form of media or a new media technology that broadens the public conversation and invites all of the smelly mouth breathers who previously didn't have a platform or weren't asked their opinion to the debate, we always say everything in society is ending. The wrong type of people. This all started with Mr. Gutenberg and his press, because the wrong type of people were going to read the Bible, and they wouldn't have anyone to explain it to them, and they would start trying to interpret it themselves. Radio meant no one's ever going to read a book again. And everyone's brain was going to rot. Television, of course, destroyed society and made sure that we were all functionally illiterate and could never have competing thought in our heads. Social media meant that the average person could be a celebrity and could challenge the powerful people that told them what they had to think every day. That used to be, they didn't have a chance to get on a TV station or a radio station or in a newspaper and share their opinions. They had to be told. And a whole lot of folks that we always said, we want a bigger democracy. We want more people to share their opinions. We want more people to be part of the public conversation. But then folks in power get horrified whenever anybody shows up, because suddenly they're not there to just say, what a great job you're doing. They're saying, I am unhappy about the following things. I have some suspicions. I have some crazy misunderstandings. I'm going to behave like a normal member of society with things to do. So when we talk about polarization and when we talk about populism, don't underestimate that is the snobs saying there are new people in the conversation, and I don't think they're our class steer.
Talk about the negativity of social media then. Talk about the downside of the conversation that does tend to happen.
Well, when you're a government that invites giant tech platforms into your country and doesn't regulate them and doesn't make them accountable in the way you make every one of your domestic operators accountable, and you say, we're going to use our secret algorithm to weaponize body dysmorphic and eating disorder information to 16-year-old girls until the suicide rate actually climbs. Is the problem the platform's attempt to do it or the government's failure to do anything at any point to stop them? So yes, non-identity-based tech platforms where people cannot ever have to account for a real identity, not use their real names, not be identifiable such that libel or defamation or harm accountability tools can be used against them. Those are bad for society. But are the tools bad? No. I mean, were letters to the editor bad? They were thought to be kind of radical initially, and dumb things could be said in them. So there is a need to regulate tech platforms, but the regulation of tech platforms is really taking away from them the notion that they get to behave as media with all of the protections of never being sued, but none of the accountabilities that those organizations have. And what's the first thing you do? You got to protect kids from them. Do I worry about adults with these platforms? Absolutely not. I'm only worried about kids.
Interesting way of looking at it. Talk to me about populism. It's this phrase that people use that I've never been comfortable with. Because anytime I see someone being accused of being a populist, they're actually finding policies that people are interested in. They're talking to issues that in our country, Canadians are interested in. That's not populism. That's actually trying to get to the root of some problems.
Yeah, populism is code for a couple of things. It's code for angry. It's code for white. It's code for rural. And when economies get bad and opportunity indexes decrease, those populations behave a certain way that we often refer to as populist. When suddenly I look at my kids and say my kids do not have the same opportunity to invest in the market, do not have the same opportunity to own a home in the neighborhood they were raised in, do not have the same professional opportunity to join the field I'm in because the rented profession won't let them in, the union doesn't exist to the same extent it did, the economic opportunity in our town has atrophied, and I don't have the means to move to the food and relocate, those people get angry. They get angry because they were told if I obeyed the rules and I did everything and I took my garbage in every Thursday morning and I mowed my lawn and I was nice to my neighbors and I showed up at church, that I would have an opportunity to have a good life, but my kids would have a good life. And when you interrupt that path of opportunity, you get a pretty big rupture. And we saw it in the late 60s and early 70s, and we're seeing it right now because Canadians, particularly Canadians who don't live in dense urban populaces, are wondering, why do I not have access to investment products that are as good as the ones my parents could invest in? Why do I not have an ability to invest in the housing market in the way my parents did? And why does it seem like new folks to Canada have a faster path to success than I do?
There's a great episode of Newsroom where they have an environmental scientist on. And he talks about the reason the world's going to end. And there's absolutely nothing even the best scientists in the world could ever do. It's one of these great TV broadcasts where everybody's depressed by the end of it. I know you're not that way. Why are you so optimistic about Canada too? Because I know you are.
Well, because things are pretty good. I have a pretty good life. You have a pretty good life. We get to do pretty interesting work every day. What's the sum total of what your members do every day? They fundamentally change the economic direction of Canadian families. They say, we're going to inject 3 months or 9 months or 18 or 24 months of intense training and in turn change the economic opportunity that sits in front of that individual and their future family. That's pretty powerful stuff. That's not bad work. That's not showing up at the coalface every day feeding the man. So there's lots of opportunity to do good things. So my skepticism when I get angry about Canada and some weakness on public policy, it's not because the index of opportunity isn't there or people aren't committed to doing good work. It's that sometimes it's just a little bit too easy.
Your firm's done some good work, I'll say it out loud, on the international student issue in reframing the conversation, because it started with a very bad tone for our sector as if we were the problem. And by the end of the debate, about 30 days later, we had turned the corner that career colleges were not the problem. We had less than 5% of the international students in our institutions, but it was a rough, tough month. To build on that, I'm interested, what's the worst government decision you've ever seen or the worst media management thing you've ever seen around Ottawa or in governments that you've been involved in?
There were two that are my favorite. I'll give you the first, which is I worked for the most honorable man who ever served as a Premier of Nova Scotia. His name was Dr. John Ham. And Dr. Ham, when he was elected Premier of Nova Scotia in 1999, realized that the budget had not been balanced at that point in 37 years.
37, really? 37 years?
37 years of deficits. They had taken over a steel company and were running it as a province. the fundamental drag on that economy as a result of decades of bad public policy from all parties. So Dr. Ham initiated a program review process. And if listeners have never heard of that, get used to it, because a new government in Canada in 2025, 2026 is going to be running something called program review. And that's where you take every single program delivered by government, they're giant binders, and we go through them one by one and we say, is this essential? Is this just necessary? Is this discretionary? Can we get rid of it? And you literally go through everything. So we were working alphabetically, and the first item in the first binder in this tiny little boardroom was something called the Apple Maggot Control Board. And that sounded like a funny name, and we were all laughing at it. This program review is going to be the easiest process in the world. Of course, we can get rid of the Apple Maggot Control Board. So these two lovely gentlemen from the Department of Agriculture were at the end of the table, and they were willing to do whatever we wanted. They were perfect partners as public servants. And we said, okay, what do you do? And they say, well, if there's a breakout of Apple Maggot, we deal with it. And they say, well, could we deliver this through a different means or shut down the Apple Maggot Control Board? They say, absolutely. Anything you want, we'll do. We just have one question. What do you want us to do with the warehouses? And we said, well, why do you own warehouses? And they said, well, that's where we keep the flamethrowers. And at this point, you realize everything you do or touch in government is more complicated than you think. Easy decisions don't end up on cabinet tables. If you are elected to do public policy at the highest level of provincial or federal government, everything by the time it gets to you is the best worst decision. And in that case, the Apple Maggot Control Board used to deputize fruit farmers to go pick up flamethrowers and go burn down orchards. We didn't even know what the legal authority to do this was. It was terrifying. It was one of these things where suddenly you pull on a thread and you unravel whole cloth. Government is insanely complicated because of its obligation to be fair to the greatest number of people the greatest amount of the time, and because they occupy the space that no one else will occupy. So that was a decision where getting rid of the Apple Maggot Control Board was not the easy decision that we thought it was going to be.
And that's got to be, I hope, the only meeting in your career where what do we do with the flamethrowers was one of the considerations.
Only time I've dealt with flamethrowers in public policy.
Probably not the only time you've wanted to use them, though.
It's true.
That's true. So is there another? You said two.
The second one, really, really, really bad public policy. So a favorite and deeply transformational leader of the province of Ontario, Mike Harris, who essentially rebooted through a shock treatment the entire public service, public spending lens, tax framework, economic growth framework for the province of Ontario back in 1995. Mike was controversial. There were labor upsets. Mike also, moved really, really fast. And he did things like anyone who was trans and who was in sex reassignment surgery, he cut the funding when they were in mid-process. And it was a decision that I think they thought there was a clarity to at the time. And it was the cruelest thing I've ever been adjacent to watch a government do. And now, 25 years later, we're back beating up deeply marginalized trans people again because it feels weird and it feels easy. That's one I'm pretty ashamed to have been close to.
Again, back to the positive side, you talked about the agriculture bureaucrats in Nova Scotia. I'm interested in your thoughts because in my 30 years in Ottawa, I'm constantly blown away by the quality and the depth of the public service. And they take a bit of a beating, but they are a group of extremely committed and very bright people at the highest levels could run any corporation in Canada.
I think that's true of the 1,250 people who lead the public service. You don't meet very many DIM, directors general, or assistant deputy ministers or deputy ministers. Your average public servant who, needs to get home in the 2:45 traffic jam in Ottawa, I don't walk through Place de Portage and think it's a particularly inspiring place.
Fair.
There are lots of public servants who've chosen a career in the public service, not just because of mission, but because it's easy. But that's not their fault. That's the fault of a public service that isn't demanding the best from them. But the good news is in Canada, we're probably going to have a change in our federal government mid-2025, and between 75 and 100,000 people are going to lose their jobs.
I think the numbers will be that high.
I hope they are.
Yeah.
We've hired 150,000 people in 5 years. We've bought 3 World War IIs in the last 5 years. So while they're all good people, I'm confident that if they're talented, they're going to get other work, and that maybe they're going to use Canada's college system to retrain and get on a path they should be on. But I think that you could walk into Tunney's pasture and get rid of all of the people on 18 of the 25 floors and not affect the quality of service offered to a Canadian citizen. The leadership of the public service, exceptionally talented. The average bloated ranks, I think there's a soft bigotry of low expectations there.
It's not a view you'll hear every day in Ottawa. I think there's a lot of accuracy to it. Let's go back to the issue we've been spending so much time talking about, international students. We jump around on this podcast on purpose because there's lessons to be learned from our guests, but also some things that are going on that need to be discussed. Your firm's worked through this file with us on international students. Where do you see it going, and how do you see how we got to where we are?
Like many public policy files, the answer is just more. It isn't binary. It isn't this will succeed or this will not succeed. The Canadian economy is good at three things: pension funds and a regulated financial sector, pulling things out of the ground or growing things and then selling them, and bringing immigrants into the country and getting them buying our houses. That's the Canadian economy writ large. We are, on our best day, fancy Ukraine. So 1/3 of our economy is driven by housing starts and new entrants to Canada, but it's a volume dial. And some years you turn it up too far and there's an exigency and an externality because you don't have the ability to receive people. Anyone who's ever worked with an immigrant settlement organization or a training organization knows that the one piece that you can never skip when you bring someone into your country is you've got to have an ability to receive them. You've got to make sure that there's a plausible network that they plug into, there's plausible housing available. And we turned the volume knob up so high because we could in COVID and because it was an easy economic choice to make. We didn't necessarily set people up for success and have enough means of housing, platforming, accommodating people. And it was a hot economic opportunity. So people tooled to it really quickly because that's what you do. But we got to tweak the knob. We got to turn the knob again. And the numbers year on year, for a long time, we had very, very stable net numbers in the sort of 3 to 350 range. We turned the number way, way up recently. So don't mistake when people say anything other than what we had last year constitutes an abandonment of immigration as a public policy file. No, we might just correct to, back to where we were 18 months ago. It's a dial. You make a discretionary choice every year, and it's got to be based on things like how much housing stock's available, how much economic opportunity available, how much training capacity is available, how much absorption is there. You've got to have a biscuit that can soak up the gravy. And if you don't, then you're setting people up for failure. So when I look at the international student file, the thing that breaks my heart isn't the story about, communities being upset. It's the story about the person who paid a generational wealth amount from their family in India, who came here and had a really, really, really bad experience and didn't have delivered to them a product that would create the economic opportunity that they were promised that normally you get when you come here.
And in fairness, we've seen that at all levels of the post-secondary system. We've seen it at some career colleges. We've seen it at community colleges, and we've seen it at universities. And it is a shame because you're right, the impact back to that family that has put everything into getting one son or daughter here to give them a fresh start. That's a really important point. So let's go back to a different topic. You talked earlier that you feel Justin Trudeau is going to get reelected in 2025. I believe that's what I heard you say. Am I correct there?
Well, I would say, do you believe that Justin Trudeau will be the first prime minister since Wilfrid Laurier to win 4 back-to-back governments? Do you believe that Justin Trudeau has transcended Wilfrid Laurier's legacy and will be reelected? I think historically that would be asymmetric.
It's a good point that gets lost. We focus on the numbers and the polling. It is hard to win 3 in a row.
I have had a deck that I use for CEOs that we present to, where I have a National Film Board clip from July 1983 about flight AC-143 Montreal to Edmonton. And that was a flight that took off out of Montreal, and the pilots discovered over northern Ontario, the Montreal fuelers didn't know metric and had loaded 45% of the required fuel. The pilot was an experienced glider pilot and managed to find a semi-abandoned runway in Gimli, Manitoba, your home province, that was actually being used for a car racing event that day. They cleared the runway and he put the plane down safely. Air Canada used that plane for another decade. Losing isn't bad. There's a false binary. There's a bit of a cognitive bias where we think when you lose an election, you're dumb and you did everything wrong, and the winners did everything right. Stephen Harper, when he was defeated in 2015, left his caucus with 99 seats, one of the largest oppositions ever in Canadian history, and his party continued to have a lead in fundraising and be a significant political force. Just because you're not in power doesn't mean you've been defeated and removed from the Canadian body politic. The tide goes in, the tide goes out. The Trudeau era, I think, will be historically respected for fundamentally changing the conversation on climate, Indigenous, and gender in a way that no other government before them did. They will also be held to account for creating more debt per Canadian than any government in history in real numbers and proportionate numbers. And when we discover the consolidated general debt is $1.5 trillion, I think we're all going to be pretty shocked.
And it's going to lead to the outcomes you're talking about earlier on program review. Government's going to have no choice, no matter who the government is.
We could have a minority government of the Bloc, the New Democrats, the Conservative. Anything could happen. I'm not going to presuppose, though I have a suspicion about who will be governing in Canada in late 2025. There's more than one outcome that's possible. The Deputy Minister of Finance, a man named Mr. Forbes, is going to show up and brief that new government. And what he tells them will make them regret that they put their names on the ballots.
It's always a good line from Chad. I have to say, been around elections now for 40-odd years. I've never
really old.
Yeah, I'm not as old as others, but yes. And I've not seen a group be so focused on message as maybe Mike Harris was with the Common Sense Revolution for a year before an election. They were pretty focused on their message, but this group is extremely focused. I watched it on the weekend. We were talking about this earlier. I think I saw 3 themes on social media across the weekend from Conservative candidates from coast to coast. Axe the tax, build the houses, stop the crime. Sounds like a pretty good formula to get people to vote for you, doesn't it?
Yeah, but remember, the politics is the symptom. It's not the disease. Canadians are asking candidates to respond to those issues because the economic and social conditions in their community have changed. It is not that people have decided that Pierre Poilievre is just a smarter person than Justin Trudeau. It's the economy changed around them, and they don't feel Justin Trudeau changed with it. They feel less safe in their communities, and smart people are telling them that what they're feeling is wrong. It is all what the voter is actually feeling and experiencing, not what people are telling the voter they're feeling and experiencing. You can tell the voter something's really important. If they don't feel it, it doesn't work.
You've gotten to know our sector, the regulated career college sector in Canada. You once told an audience of our members that we needed to put a crow on a post. Maybe reiterate that story, but what have you seen? What are you optimistic or negative about the post-secondary education sector?
At the place I was lucky enough to grow up in the summers on the Trout River in Stanley Bridge, Prince Edward Island, we would get a murder of crows that would set in very, very early in the summer. And you don't want a big murder of crows because they are very, very loud. They're very, very messy, but they will squeeze out all the songbirds and all the bats. And you want both of those things. Now, there is only one way to get rid of crows because crows are very, very smart, which is you have to kill one of them and you have to nail it to a tree or a post. Crows won't come within a mile of a dead crow. Sometimes when we are in a sector where we are being held accountable to say your standards are weak, your enforcement is weak, I think you are defined by the worst story I've ever seen about you, not the best story. How do you fix that? You fix that by demonstrating you are completely unafraid to hold people accountable. And you're not going to hold everyone accountable in a way that isn't sincere. But if someone strays across the red line, you are going to be fearless in enforcement. I think that's true of any space that's regulated when there is good governance.
It's a very good point. We were chatting before we went on the air this morning, catching up about our board chair, Vic Tazan from Sprott Shaw College. And you asked, what are they all about? And I gave you a little bit of rundown on them. 135-year-old college teaching nursing right now, dental office assistants, healthcare aides, legal assistants, but we're judged by the lowest common denominator sometimes. Often not members, often fly-by-night, popped up, unregulated too. So it's a very good point.
Yeah, then it's your job to say, these are the standards, this is who's in our club, this is who isn't, and we will be fearless in holding bad actors accountable. And it's hard to do because sometimes you have to hold your friends accountable, and sometimes you have to walk away from your friends and not explain that the circumstances were very complicated, even though they did something wrong.
And it's a good thing that's come out of the international student issue because it's forced us to deal with it. It's forced us to take a deep breath and go, what do we need to do? Now's our opportunity because everyone's focused on the opportunity. People don't know the level of regulation that we do operate in the provinces that we're in as well. So that's come out of it too, which has been helpful.
Yeah, I'll do something unusual too, which is I'll congratulate a Liberal who isn't super popular in Ottawa right now. The Minister of Immigration, who was governing in Canada through a crisis where our borders were closed, Marco Mendocino, managed to find a way to keep our immigration number up by getting people who were here on permanent residency, who were stranded here, who already had paperwork in the system. Marco was fearless and bold in a way that no immigration minister, frankly, since Jason Kenney had been. And then for a whole bunch of reasons, he ended up in a different portfolio and taking the hit for other things. So there's also some success in this that was very, very strange. The COVID was an N of one unique circumstance. So turning that dial way up seemed like a good idea at the time. And I think Marco Mendocino I hope that when, the organizations that recognize public policy leaders for making tough decisions, I hope that his legacy gets recast and people reconsider it in the days ahead.
Interestingly, Minister Miller, who took on the file, inherited a real mess on the international student file.
Well, he's certainly willing to tell everyone he inherited a mess because he's the Prime Minister's little buddy. So we all have to listen to Mark Miller because he's not a real cabinet minister. He's the Prime Minister's buddy. So his job is to sit there and take cheap shots at Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition, and to pretend he's a serious public policy leader, not the Prime Minister's little friend. Mark Miller's baseless, sleazy attacks on other politicians, I think he's the type of senior public servant, the type of elected official you just have permission to ignore.
Well, paying attention to the policy decision he took, we actually agreed with big chunks of it because there were too many international students coming into Canada. And some communities were getting absolutely slammed.
We're very lucky we have great deputy ministers at IRCC.
We actually do have very, very strong deputies. The one that was there now is there now, and Christian Fox that was there before.
Very, very strong deputies.
Yeah, but we actually agreed with a lot of what the policy outcomes were goals. We strongly disagreed with the language that was being used towards our sector. But there was an issue with the overall numbers, which we then proved. Conestoga College bringing 37,000 new students into one community in 1 year. That has to be dealt with.
When you have to have a correction, corrections are hard. You have to prove you learned a lesson. One of the sad rules of all public affairs is that if the public has identified a problem, part of your response has to be the assignment of blame. And the assignment of blame sometimes is convenient and fast. Mm-hmm. And you have to pick a villain quickly. And you've got to hang, when in fact there's a holistic reason, there were legitimate reasons. It's more complicated, both in the origin of the problem and the solution. But, we've had to do a pretty fast correction on this one. And, who's a villain?
We were a convenient crow.
Exactly.
We were a convenient crow. So let's jump into two things. I've got the pleasure of knowing your teams here 20 odd years or something like that. Personally, yourself. I know the team loves being around you, but what's the greatest skill that you've got or you learned? Maybe you wish you had it earlier. Maybe it's something you develop later in life that makes you successful. And maybe it's something a student should work on. Maybe it's something an instructor should work on. What's that skill, that one thing that makes Chad Rogers successful? Not likable, because we know that's not possible.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's mine. I'd say it's a thing that I wish I was better at, that I'm jealous of in other people. I'm not the smartest person in most rooms, either in our office or in Ottawa or in any of the provincial capitals or cities we work in. But I am willing to wake up an hour or two earlier than everyone else in the room and go deep on Google and try and find some information and try and do a couple of extra hours work that everyone else didn't do. And my mentors, people like the great Finlay MacDonald Jr., were always very clear with me, which is to say, you won't always be the best, but you can always work a little harder. You can brute force your way around most other people. I'd encourage everyone to go on YouTube and look for the infamous Allen Iverson practice video and the 17 times he says practice. You can be a deeply gifted person, but if you're not willing to do the conditioning, if you're not willing to show up for practice, every boxer will tell you a boxing match is won at 5 o'clock in the morning in a rubber suit running up a hill. It is not won in the ring. It's won in the conditioning. So what do I yell at? The average age of our colleagues around here is fetus. And what do I yell at them for? You cannot show up just because you're talented and expect that everyone is going to regard your talent and you're just going to be really good. You got to show up before your client, before your competitor, and you have to put an hour's more work in than anybody else did. That is the way you guarantee, if not success, at least a promise of performance.
So it's not like one of our favorite places mutually is Palm Springs. And we both enjoy that, where the average age there is deceased. So it's a little different here at Crestview. It's fetus.
Yeah, everyone I work with is insanely young and really, really smart and
hungry,
quite fearless. So, we all like to crap on millennials and Gen Z and now Gen Alpha coming up. You're getting people who are total digital natives, who have a better ability to go find information from a broader amount of sources than we ever did, who are very, very cosmopolitan in their worldview. But for a lot of their childhoods, they've been taught that discomfort is a stop sign. And what they were actually being taught was discomfort was a warning sign. And you can't confuse warning signs and stop signs. Because if you want to participate in a high-performance culture, I had breakfast with a lobbyist I have a ton of respect for, who works for a tech company here in Ottawa, who just finished a marathon. And I asked, how many toenails have you lost? Because if you're a marathon runner, you're going to lose toenails. that's discomfort.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a high performance outcome, you have to be willing to figure out how much discomfort is safe. How far are you willing to push yourself? I don't know that I'm capable of that kind of high performance activity, but the one commitment I'll make to myself, even as I get older, is you got to get up an hour earlier. You got to stay up an hour later. You got to sit and write a thank you note. You've got to do the work that your competitor won't do.
Marathoner is not one of the things that comes to mind with Chad Rogers.
No.
I got to throw you a little curveball. There's some main partners at Crestview here that I know with Ginny and Mark and Rob and others. What makes that group, and I'm going to kind of maybe go with Ginny and Mark, who I know better than anybody. What makes the three of you a unique kind of cool partnership? Because you're all completely different people in many ways.
Well, commercial partnerships are 50% akin to a sibling relationship, where you've got to love the person and trust the person and have some confidence in their character, but recognize you're going to be frustrated. It's not always going to be perfect and easy. And 50%, you have to be completely aligned in what your commercial goal is. And you actually have to have written down on a paper what that goal is, what the quantum is affiliated with it, and be honest with each other about how you're going to get there. And when you're not getting there, be fearless about what you're going to do to respond. So like anything, have you found people that you have enough faith in their character to work with them closely and bind your future to them? But more importantly, do you have a shared sense of vision that's actually written down on a piece of paper that you can hold each other accountable for?
What's Mark Spiro's skill? I haven't figured it out yet.
He is the most frighteningly smart person I've ever worked with. For those folks who are listening who've never met Mark, if you remember the meme Grumpy Cat, he is the human embodiment of Grumpy Cat. But he and I have been working together in one way or another for about 27 years. And I'm very lucky to have him as my partner.
He's one of the most loyal human beings you ever meet, too. I know Mark's one of those guys, if I call him tomorrow, he'll be grumpy, but he'll show up to help. And that's a huge skill. So let's wrap up with our question we ask every guest. Because this is about leadership. It is about skills. Who's the greatest mentor in your life? The person that probably had, and you can name a few. And as I've said on other episodes, it's interesting how many people have called me the day after and go, I wish I'd mentioned, because we've got hundreds in our life. Who's the one?
Finley McDonald Jr. Finley was a national CTV reporter. He helped create Newsworld. He was a consultant. When I moved down to Nova Scotia and worked for the government there, Finn was kind of the outside advisor that the premier used to go to, who's the Evian Grease, maybe the coolest person I've ever known. Sadly, we lost Finn in 2003. He died quite young at 57. I think Finn was probably more generous than any other mentor I've had, who he would sit down and just help you unpack where you were getting in your own way. I've been blessed with just tons of great mentors. Paul M. Skierman, who I worked for at the radio station in Prince Edward Island, who would beat me about the head when I was just being an idiot. Or just some mentors that you have a light relationship with, but they're so gifted at giving good advice. I don't know if you know David McNaughton, Canada's former ambassador to Washington.
Yep.
I don't know that there's a person who can give tough advice more gently in the world than David. There's a reason why the Prime Minister tries to keep David very close, because David is the wise uncle that you want on your side. I realize I've just mentioned three men in a row. You know, the person who is the lodestar, the moral compass in our family is my mom, and not in the way that, you know, everyone idolizes their mom, but my mom is a very tough woman. And my view on standards and labor and work and jobs all comes from the very tough counsel my mom gave us growing up. I came back from my first job at the grocery store, and I was very unhappy with the way the business was run. And as opposed to, you know, mollycoddling me, as I think a lot of parents would do, my mother said, I want you to go out to the garden hose in the backyard, and I want you to fill the bucket of water, and then I want you to put your hand in it and pull it out really quick. And the hole you leave behind is your work life. You need them more than they need you. Get over it. That was the first piece of advice I ever got professionally from the old bird.
That one. That's a good one.
Yeah. She's a tough lady.
It's interesting that I reflect on somebody different. One of mine was a very strange one and probably had 5 business interactions with the gentleman, or personal ones. Like Glenn Shortlift, the former clerk of the Privy Council, had an office across from me in a corporate center. And he came over one day, closed the door, and just lit me up with some of the greatest advice I'd ever had. And he just was reminding me, new to Ottawa, stop with the politicians, focus on the bureaucracy. You got a long file here, work the file. And he just knocked me down to calm down and drop the ego and just do the hard work. And so it's funny how we all have these interactions in our life. Before we wrap up, anything else you want to talk about that's going on in the world, or you see, or you just want to put on the table today?
We're going to have a very tough few economic years. We're going to have some slow growth. It's going to be very hard to get above 2% most years in the next 3 to 5, I fear. interest rates are not going to go back to what we viewed as the floor. They're going to stay closer to what is the true median of the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you look at Unilever that's just decided to sell their entire ice cream division because they don't want to run a cold supply chain anymore because they look at a cold supply chain as too expensive. Fleet and fuel is just going to be too expensive for the next 10 years. So as we look at our businesses, there's still lots and lots and lots of opportunity, but it's a time to get the fat off your P&L, and it's the time to tighten up your business plan. Make sure you know where you're going to find your growth, because it's not going to be easy. It's not to say it's going to be so hard that it's dangerous, but there's not easy wins. We're going to have a few years where the clever and the more deliberate are going to dramatically outpace the folks who just sat and waited for it all to change.
That's a really thoughtful piece there to finish us up, but I can't let you off the hook. I need people to understand your thoughts on pumpkin spice coffee.
It is just nutmeg with orange food coloring. And anyone who believes that pumpkin spice is a real thing is stupid. It is a fake holiday and a fake brand created to lure stupid people to spend stupid money on nutmeg, a spice that no one really likes.
And yet one that you and I celebrate every year.
Well, you do.
You never really do join in, do you?
No, I don't.
On that note, Chad, thank you for everything you're doing. Also, thank you. There's a lot of communities and people you impact, and you and Mark are always making an impact. Living in Toronto, but helping CHEO every year, helping different communities with things they need. You are one of the more charitable people I know. And also, I'm pleased to call you a friend. So thanks for joining us today. And with that, we'll wrap up this week's version of EdUp Canada, and we look forward to hearing you all again next week. Thanks for listening to another episode of the EdUp Canada podcast. We release new episodes regularly, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you know when they are officially out. If you love this episode, please leave a 4- or 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts so that others can also discover how a set of skills can lead to success. Thanks for learning with us.